Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out tonight. I'm Terry Campbell. I'm the Adult Program Coordinator here at the library. Welcome to the Nature Speak series. We are in partnership with the Prospect Heights Natural Resource Commission. Some of the commissioners are here if you just want to raise your hand. If you want to learn more about the commission, or better yet, you want to volunteer with them, go and see them after the program. I'll let you know that our next Nature Speaks will be January 30th, 2020. And we have Dr. Catherine Moore Powell from the Field Museum, and she's a climate change ecologist, and she'll be talking about climate change and building healthy, resilient urban green spaces. So look for that in our newsletter. Tonight we have with us Bob Dean. He's the Chief Executive Officer for the Center of Neighborhood Technology, and he has served as the Deputy Executive Director for Planning for the Chicago Metropolitan Agency. And he actually, before that, managed the Go to 2040, the award-winning comprehensive plan for the Chicago metropolitan area that was adopted in October 2010. He holds a master's degree in planning from Cornell and a bachelor's in history from the University of Delaware. So we're in good hands tonight to learn about flooding in the region and what you can do about it. So please welcome Bob Dean.
Well, thank you for coming tonight, and thanks especially to the members of the Prospect Heights Natural Resources Commission for inviting me out, and to Dana and Agnes in particular for hosting and for showing me some of the impressive work that group has done with other volunteer support too in restoring some of the natural areas here in this community. So let me explain a little bit about who the Center for Neighborhood Technology is for those who are new to the organization, and I'm guessing very few of you know who CNT is, which is fine. We are a national organization. We work in cities, suburbs, and metropolitan areas across the country. And for 40 years, we've operated with a mission of trying to achieve environmental sustainability and social equity. We have a 40-year history. I have much shorter history. I've been at CNT for only a year, but as their new CEO, I'm trying to help them continue this work. We are based in Chicago, even though we work across the country. And wherever we work, we begin with the belief that every community has assets. And in some cases, these are underused or hidden, but we believe that these assets in every neighborhood, in every town, in every community can be used to position them for future prosperity and future sustainability. A major key to our work is a thread of seeing connections that most people don't. So we don't believe, for example, there's any conflict between building resilience to climate change and creating job opportunities. There are things we can do that achieve both of those goals. And a major mission of our organization is to find solutions that achieve multiple outcomes, or a single action or single investment can move us in a positive direction along a number of dimensions. Our mission also is to position communities to anticipate and prepare for future change. So a big part of that, which I'll talk about tonight, is climate change, which we believe is a real existential threat to our planet and way of life, but also other types of changes like technological change, which can bring new opportunities, but also the potential to increase disparities between different people within our population. And we found often the people who are most vulnerable are the ones who have most trouble adopting or adapting to change. So we put a real focus on equity in our work and trying to help those who would not otherwise have the resources to solve their own problems. So to summarize briefly what it is that we do, we conduct rigorous analysis of problems that communities face. We have research scientists and programmers and other kinds of data experts. We work in neighborhoods and municipalities to engage local residents. And then with these local partners, we co-design solutions, either policy changes or financial ideas or technological ideas that can help to solve the problems that you face. And sometimes when we see gaps, we actually start to offer solutions and deliver programs ourselves. So before I jump into the main piece of the talk tonight, which is about urban flooding, let me just ask for shows of hands on a couple dimensions. Are there any people here who are hydrologists or stormwater engineers or landscape architects who professionally work with water? Okay, great. And are there people here who have personally experienced or been impacted by urban flooding or any kind of flooding in Prospect Heights or in nearby communities that you have had flooding yourselves? Okay. So anyone who just had your hand up, I'm the one up here talking, but everyone who just raised their hand are people who have real expertise in what the actual problems, the causes, the solutions are in your communities. So what I'll try to do tonight is give a little bit of perspective that I hope is useful, leaving plenty of time at the end for discussion. But then when it comes to discussion, this is going to be less of a Q&A, and I'm going to hope to do this more of a conversation, because there are probably people in this room who can help each other solve problems that you are facing when it comes to knowledge or information or other things that you need to know about flooding and how it affects you. So let me jump in here. So the topic of my talk tonight is urban flooding, which I'll distinguish from other types of flooding. What I mean by urban flooding is flooding that happens when it simply rains too much or in too high volume or too fast for our systems to get the water out of there. So this is distinct from something like coastal flooding that you hear of in major cities on the coast, where sea level rise and major storm surge causes flooding. It also is distinct in some ways from riverine flooding, which is what happens when major rainfalls upstream sweep downstream and cause major flooding there as well. What I'm going to be mostly talking about, and all of these are very important types of flooding to deal with, the part that I'm mainly focusing on tonight is urban flooding, which is what happens when there's too much rainfall, which local sewer systems can't get rid of. So this is also called pluvial flooding, if you want to use a more scientific term, pluvial having to do with rainfall. So one of the conditions of urban flooding, or some key words that I just want to throw out here, is that it's repetitive. So urban flooding happens usually in the same kinds of places over and over. This isn't a one-time 100-year event. It's something that happens constantly. It's chronic, and so again, it happens repeatedly. It affects quality of life, and some people call this nuisance flooding. We don't call it nuisance flooding, because really having significant flooding in your home or in your backyard or in roads that you use every day is more than a nuisance. It can be a real problem and a deterrent to quality of life. And another significant piece of urban flooding is where it happens. It can happen within places that are supposed to flood, within floodplains. Just as frequently, or even more frequently, it happens outside of floodplains, where FEMA and where others say there's not actually flooding in this location. So to just illustrate this point, here is a map that you can get from the FEMA website. We are in that yellow star right there, so this is mainly Prospect Heights and a couple surrounding communities. And what's shown here, the areas that are cross-hatched are water bodies. The areas in blue are places where, according to FEMA's analysis, it should flood once every 100 years. So once in your lifetime, if you live in the blue areas...
Are you going to correct that? It should happen
yeah.
1%.
Correct. There's a 1% chance each year. So this is correct. The landscape architect has a more precise way of defining it, which is more correct. Each year there should be a 1% chance, which means you may experience this twice in your lifetime. More than that is really unusual. And I think that just judging by the reaction, this is not what people are actually experiencing in their actual life. What we see is actually in these 100-year floodplains, the 1% chance of flooding. It floods far more frequently than 1% of the years, and there's also flooding that happens that has nothing to do with these floodplains in other places entirely within a community. So generally what we conclude from this is that flooding is a lot more widespread than what is shown on the official maps. Some work that we did some years ago showed that in Cook County, about $160 million per year of insurance claims are filed for flooding damage. Now, even that we think is underreported, because not everyone submits insurance claims. But even if you just use that, a huge amount of damage every year is caused by flooding. We have summarized all of this in a report that you can Google there. It's called The Prevalence and Cost of Urban Flooding. The map on the right shows where flooding is most frequent in Cook County. So where we are right now is right at the top of that shaded area in the, if I can figure out how the clicker works here. I'm not even going to try. I'm just going to point to the very top of the darkest shaded area is where we are now. 90% of the flood damage that happens in Cook County is outside of those FEMA mapped floodplains that I just showed. So the vast majority of flooding actually happens no place near a river body. And this is actually most extreme in some areas in Chicago that have no rivers or streams or any other water bodies within miles. And in Chicago, it turns out the incidence of urban flooding is actually very strongly correlated with income and with race. In the suburbs, that's less true. There's urban flooding in other places in the suburbs, but you still can see some correlation with income that really the highest income places are often those that don't really have to deal with this challenge, and more as moderate income communities are those that are burdened with significant urban flooding. And the amount of flooding that we get is significant. So the headline here is from the Tribune a couple months ago. I didn't write this is a Tribune headline, but it's accurate, which is over the past 10 years, only places that have been hit by hurricanes have had as much damage as Chicago has, if you take all of the damage from flooding that we experienced over that time. So in other words, the repetitive chronic flooding that I talked about is the equivalent of getting hit with a hurricane. But there's a lot less attention to it. I mean, it's less photogenic. You don't have the massive waves battering, Cape Hatteras. You don't have farmhouses flooding down the Mississippi on swollen rivers. These aren't named storms. You don't get Red Cross campaigns to deal with flooding damage in Chicago because it's more insidious. It happens in people's basements. It happens in yards. And often this is seen as a problem that individuals just have to deal with themselves, that it's a personal property thing that's your problem, when really it's often an insufficiency of local infrastructure is what's causing a flooding that affects people's properties. So the picture here is a particularly bad type of flooding, which is basement backups. I hope people here aren't experiencing this kind of flooding, but this is what happens when the combined sewer systems back up into people's basements, which carry a mixture of sewage and stormwater and basically contaminate entire basements. So in some of the neighborhoods in Chicago where we work, every time it rains more than 3/4 of an inch, you have this type of experience happens, which is horribly disruptive to people who live there. And this type of flooding is expected to increase over time. So the graph here is from the Illinois State Climatologist from about a year or two ago. The blue line is precipitation results by year. The red line shows a kind of average from the 1980s on, so that's just a flat line showing like where we've been for the past about 30 years. And then the green line shows just a really easy linear trend in rainfall. And this shows very clearly the trend in rainfall is going up. And according to all of the climate projections that we have seen, this trend is expected to continue. This is not going to reverse, it's not going to stop. We are going to continue to see more frequent, more severe storms affecting our geography. Now, our metropolitan area is generally pretty well positioned regarding climate change. We don't have sea level rise. We don't have storm surge that's really threatening our communities overall. We don't generally have extensive drought. We do, however, have more heat problems, and we're going to have more flooding problems too in the future. So as we see this trend continuing, we expect the flooding problems that you've all experienced, that we've seen more and more of, are simply going to continue to accelerate and be more common in the future. So what do we do about this? Before I get into that, let me pause and see if there's any questions. I've been talking a little while and could use a drink of water anyway, so if there are any questions or thoughts, now is a good time. Okay, I will press forward. So what kind of solutions do we have that we can use to help address this problem? So one solution is massive infrastructure. So does everyone here know what MWRD stands for? The Metropolitan Water Reclamation District. It's a very important organization when it deals with when it comes to dealing with stormwater and wastewater. It is a large. It basically covers Cook County. It's a very large organization with a lot of funding that it can use for flooding reduction problems. And the picture here is showing a part of the TARP system, which is a tunnel and reservoir system. The deep tunnel is part of that. So we're a system of reservoirs in various places around the metropolitan area that MWD has built. And this is a massive investment in infrastructure to create this really enormous amounts of capacity to manage stormwater or to store stormwater. But what you find sometimes is that there is capacity in these systems while you still have local flooding happening. And that's because water doesn't drain immediately. I mean, you can think of this as a kind of bathtub and straw analogy, that you have a giant bathtub that MWD has constructed, which can hold a ton of water, but it has to pass through these little tiny straws, which are all of the local sewer systems, before it can even get to the MWD system. And so if those are backed up or those are overwhelmed, you can still have local flooding even with this huge investment in major infrastructure. So I'm not going to criticize their investment in this. I mean, it is important for major storms, but it's not sufficient by itself. Even though they've spent all this money here, this isn't sufficient to actually solve the flooding problems that we have. So there's kind of not really a choice, but two different types of systems that you can think of here are a centralized one, which is what they've constructed, which is a couple really massive facilities, or a distributed one where you have small things all over the place that try to soak up rainwater and try to manage it where it falls. And the solution to that latter piece, to try to a distributed system that captures and treats rain as water where it falls, a term I'm going to use a lot from now on is green infrastructure, which is a whole set or suite of things you can do which use natural systems to try to help manage stormwater. So recall when you're thinking here that Chicago and much of the suburbs used to have a lot of wetlands, used to have a lot of natural areas that naturally soaked up water. We've paved over a lot of that. And so one of the ideas behind green infrastructure is to recreate our capacity to use natural systems to handle this kind of water. So there are many types of contexts in which you can use green infrastructure. One is in the public right-of-way. So this is just an artist rendering that we've used in one of our plans before that show in the road right-of-way here the installation of a green infrastructure. You also can do this in major institutions. So this is a picture of St. Al's. This is a terrible picture that I got from Google Maps because I forgot to take one out when I was out here the other day. But this is an example of you can't really see, but this is a naturalized planting that used to be all turf grass that now soaks in a lot more water than it used to. Or you can do things on private property in people's homes. So here's an example of work that we have done. All of these next pictures are in the Village of Oak Park. Showing here a place where the homeowner wanted to retain their lawn. It used to flood like this. The construction project involved the construction of a dry well and drain, essentially a big a capacity under their yard, and then the replanting of grass on top of that, allowing them to use the yard, but also creating stormwater capacity. Another possibility would be this kind of rain garden and bioswale here, which you could do if you're okay with losing some grass and returning that instead to a more natural system. So for a couple slides now, I'm going to show you some hard-to-read things, which I can also supplement with some handouts afterwards, but forgive the lack of pretty pictures for a couple slides here. One of the things that we love about green infrastructure where I work is its co-benefits, by which I mean when you install green infrastructure to manage a problem, you're usually not just managing stormwater, you're doing other things with that too. So here's a matrix that we've come up with that shows the different types of benefits that you get from a natural system. When you put in pipes, the only thing you're getting from that is a pipe. But when you put in green infrastructure, you can also get improvements in water quality because the plants are actually filtering water and removing some pollutants. You get creation of natural habitat if you choose the right plant material. You can get localized improvements in air quality. So plants can even filter out some of the harmful particles in the air. They can filter noise from streets. They can also absorb CO2 and help to be an actual contributor to mitigating greenhouse gas emissions in addition to responding to increased flooding. And they can reduce urban heat islands as well. So in that way, plant material can help you to lower cooling bills in the summer by having plants nearby. And finally, green infrastructure is good for educational opportunities. So it's hard with a piece of stormwater infrastructure underground to use that to teach kids or anybody about how stormwater systems work. With something you can see that's visible on the surface, you have greater opportunities there to use this for broader educational purposes. So in this table, and I can point anyone who wants to see this, this is in a report that we did called The Value of Green Infrastructure, which you can Google. It comes up very quickly if you do that. But it shows the impacts of different types of green infrastructure like green roofs or simply trees or bioswales, permeable pavement, all of these sorts of things on these other types of co-benefits that you get from this. We also have, in addition to these kind of static things, an online tool, and this isn't live, so I can't play with it right here, but we have this tool. It's called the Green Values Toolbox, it allows you to play with different measures and see outcomes. And so if you want to see what would the impact be on soaking up rainwater from putting in a 400 square foot rain garden, or from converting my driveway from impervious surface to something more permeable, or putting a green roof on my garage or something like that. Our website here allows you to do that. You can change these different pieces that you're putting in and then see what kind of outcomes you get out of that. And again, anyone who wants to see a link or something to this, I can certainly send that to you, but it's a live online tool. We're actually redesigning it right now, so it looks a little clunky. It's going to look a little nicer in about 6 months once we're finished with that process. So these are reports that we've done that anyone can use on our website. We also have some other resources. I brought a bunch of versions of this, which I'll hand out, which is a short, just 2-pager about what you can do on your own property to do something about localized flooding. I know you're not going to be able to read this, but as soon as I'm done talking, I'll start to, actually I'll do that right now so you can look as I talk. You could grab one and hand that out. Thank you. So we actually have a program that, that does green infrastructure installation on people's properties. We've so far offered this in Oak Park and Chicago. We have contracts with both of those communities to help them to launch and to implement this program. Here's the type of stuff that we do. We come out through this. We do home assessments of what the problem is that you're facing. We do landscape design, through which we contract with landscape architects to do an actual design. We are there to help with construction, and then we do inspection and monitoring after the fact to make sure that things are actually having the effect that you expect. The woman here is one of the clients we worked with before in the Chicago neighborhood of Chatham. In her case, she had experienced over the past couple years flood damage of about $17,000 in her home. She had the basement backup issue that I was talking about. We went in with funding from the city of Chicago and made a series of upgrades that cost about $5,000. Again, that was funded by the municipality, including a backflow prevention valve, for one thing, just to prevent that disgusting backup from happening again, but then also some green infrastructure solutions. We disconnected her downspout, put in a rain garden, and rerouted her gutters to get the water away so that wouldn't flow anymore into her basement. So, and in her case, she hasn't had the flooding issues that she had before recur, so it actually has worked to prevent urban flooding in her home. So, the most challenging part of when I come and talk to groups like yours is I'm very impressed by the commitment and the knowledge that people who I've talked to here already have. So put together a couple things here about things that people here can do to try to address the issue of urban flooding. But honestly, many of you probably know these things, so I'd like to get into the discussion part and see what kind of back and forth we can get. One thing, the first bullet here is interesting. So MWD is about to start a study that goes a little bit into Prospect Heights. It's more actually Mount Prospect and communities that are down that way, but includes a little bit of Prospect Heights around urban flooding. And MWD just put out an RFP for this, which means they'll be hiring a consultant to do it. I guess they won't be starting for 6 months probably. But the RFP is the first time I've ever seen them acknowledge urban flooding as a real problem, and green infrastructure and private property investment as possible ways you could go to solve this problem. So for people who are engaged here with your municipality, or there might be public engagement opportunities, but MWD is really, I will just say, tapping into their resources and their expertise is one of the best things you can do to help solve this problem, and this study may be an opportunity for you in this geography to try to do that. They're not doing this for every place. They're doing a few of these in the city and the south suburbs, and then this one kind of centered on Mount Prospect up here, which provides a really interesting engagement opportunity. We would suggest that people who are experiencing urban flooding continue to advocate to whatever municipality they work in for the municipality to be involved in solutions. It really is hard in some of the flooding solutions for an individual homeowner to solve that. You may need either financial support in some cases or just a larger capacity sort of improvement that involves a number of neighbors instead of just one person trying to solve it on their own. So I think that trying to work at this larger scale with MWD in the city is really a critical piece. But we also think, if it's appropriate, and I'm not going to give any advice tonight because I don't know anybody's properties, but if it's appropriate for one of these types of things I just handed out to work in your home, we encourage you to try that. And the more people that do green infrastructure in your neighborhood, the better that is for everyone. This isn't like just a backflow prevention where really that pushes a problem downstream. Using green infrastructure actually soaks up water and helps your neighbors as much as it helps you. So ideally, if multiple people start to move toward these types of solutions, it really helps entire neighborhoods. I have been really impressed by some of the naturalized areas that the Natural Resource Commission showed me that they've been working on. So maintaining those and proving their benefits is also a critical thing for just keeping engagement and keeping resources flowing. And really, so this is really meant for the Natural Resources Commission in Prospect Heights, but really keep up the work that you're doing, which I think is really amazing. Some of the rest of you may be involved in the same kind of efforts in your communities. I'm only familiar with the Prospect Heights one, but really, I think there's a lot of local action and collective action by residents who are all facing these problems is really the key means of solving these issues. So I said I would not take too long with this because I do want to get into some discussion. And so that's all I have. I would like to hear if there's any questions. And honestly, I just want to say again, some of the questions I'll be able to answer. Some questions, there may be other people in the room who are better able to answer it than me. Yes, sir.
I have to replace my driveway, and I wanted to do permeable pavement. I've made a gazillion phone calls, including to the city of Glenview, which has it, and to Ryerson and the county who's done it. They gave me names. Every place I can find only does commercial or big projects. I have not found a single place that will do the residents.
Okay.
Do you know of any examples of a place that will do it?
Has anyone here worked with a company that has done individual residential permeable pavements? Because I don't know this geography. I do have a list of contractors, which I didn't bring with me, that I can send you though if you want contact information. Of people who, what's that?
What does it do? What is that? I don't know.
Oh, permeable pavement is pavement which it basically has holes in it that allows water to seep in. And so it's better than pure impervious where the water just entirely runs off. So it captures some as part of the driveway. So it's one part of a potential solution. So
Are you aware of any of the ones on the list that does residents?
I don't know. Honestly, I can get you the list that I have. I'm not sure who does residents. I can ask around my office as well for this, but yeah, I'm not sure who works in this geography who does residents, but, okay.
What's
Yes,
a
ma'am?
rain garden?
What's that?
What's a rain garden?
A rain garden. A rain garden is, would the landscape architect like to describe more clearly?
I'm a hydrologist.
Oh, hydrologist, okay.
You go ahead.
Okay, I will go ahead. A rain garden is maybe I'll go back to try to get a picture here. So a rain garden isn't exactly like this thing shown here. Well, a rain garden is part of this. A rain garden is natural plant material which is specifically selected because it likes water. And so when it rains, a rain garden drinks in water, tries to contain as much of it within that garden as possible. So it's basically not always native plants, but native plants are really good for this. So it often is made up of native plant material, which wants to drink as much water as it can. So does that make sense? Okay.
How do you compensate for the clay soil when you're trying to get water?
Yeah, I think you need to get someone who is a landscape architect, which I am not, to actually look at your situation and see what works. And so I'm not going to give you, like, always do a rain garden, always do permeable pavement or anything like that. It's very conditional, and so you need to have someone qualified to come look at your property and tell you what the answer would be. So
It was interesting to me, your Harvey Ball chart. The trees
Okay.
were one of the, it was the biggest one as far as.
trees are fantastic. Trees are good for almost everything. They're good for carbon sequestration. They're good for air quality. Yeah, tree planting. A lot of communities do tree planting, and it's for good reason because it's extremely valuable for many ways. So yeah.
Are there any particular trees that are better than others?
Oh, you're testing my knowledge here. You're going well beyond my knowledge here. I'm not a landscape architect, I'm an urban planner, so once you get into much beyond the first level of questions, I'm out of my depth. But there are lists of good plant material, which I can also provide. Or if anyone here is a naturalist and knows more about trees than I do, I encourage you to step in and answer each other's questions. So, anybody in the back know a lot about plants who wants to speak up? Or?
I would
Yes,
say
sir.
evergreens, but it's a lot where you allow forests to build up that top layer to capture, and it's kind of stored in that interstitial space of the leaves and the kind of where the soil is being made.
Okay.
I just
Thanks.
I'll
No,
just
please.
mention a little bit of my knowledge, but native grasses are really important. And so like Indian grass will have root systems, fibrous root systems that can go down 15 feet into the soil. So you have a patch of Indian grass that can absorb basically anything you throw out at it. Sometimes, I mean, trees are really excellent, but sometimes depending on the species, they'll have really shallow root systems too. And they can sometimes contribute a little bit to erosion. So you really have to have sort of a mixed system. So you don't want a place where it's just trees and shade and no understory. So you don't want to have a lot of trees in an area and then black soil underneath where you don't have an understory of native plants that can absorb the water in between those root systems.
But you do need to worry about clay, you do need to worry about planting trees in places where they grow into your sewer pipes because you don't want to create that kind of problem either. So there are a lot of conditional, site conditional things here. There was a question over here, I'm sorry.
Do you work
Yes.
with individuals or communities alone?
We work with communities, and if those communities want to run programs that involve residents, we'll happily work through that way. But we're a small nonprofit, we have about 15 staff total, working on all kinds of issues, and so we don't do direct service to individuals. We're happy to point you to a list of resources we have, but that's about as far as we go. Unless in Oak Park, we have a contract with the municipality to help them run a program to work with residents at a larger scale. So in that case, we would get more engaged, but beyond that, we don't do individual site visits or home inspections or anything like that. Yes?
And you answered my question. When you're living along the creek and due to the high water constantly, the erosion of your property is a real issue.
Mhm.
So it's not anything, having done it before, nature has gone downstream that I've planted. So you've got this going on either side of lots of areas on the creek. And there's some areas where you can't really do any of that environmental growth because each time there's just too much erosion, so the banks are washing away and all the vegetation.
Yeah.
My question before you answered it from that lady was, is anybody able to come out to properties that have that issue to do some kind of consultation? Because there are areas within Prospect Heights along McDonald Creek that are really having that kind of problem. And so would that be a community, you know, we have a Prospect Heights Creek Commission that I'm on along with some others here. If that's something that could be part of either our committee and with you working with the city to attempt to get some solution to that before all of our properties are washed away.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the kind of problem that you're right is going to be hard to solve at the level of an individual parcel of land. It's going to be a larger scale. It's going to involve either multiple property owners or the park district or the city, whoever the owner is of some of the upstream land that you're going to need to
Or
put some
downstream.
solutions on. Or downstream. Yeah, this might be in both cases, but in some of these cases you do need a corridor type approach. There are some things that you can plausibly do just on your property, and the sheet I gave you recommends a lot of those. There are many cases where nothing you can do is going to be the solution, and it needs to be something that happens in a different location nearby.
And you don't offer that advice for individual property or two?
We don't have really the resources to come out and look at individual properties one at a time. So if a municipality or a park district or someone like that wanted to do something larger scale, we would get engaged. But if it's an individual looking for a single property solution, that's not the right scale
Or
for
if
us.
it's more, then it's a coordination with the city in order to
Yeah,
work with someone else.
right.
Yeah.
Right.
okay.
We want to work with the unit of government to have a main partner who's our main contact.
Okay, thank you.
So, yeah, sure.
What's a bioswale? Is
that how you pronounce it?
Yes, yes, that is how you pronounce
That's
it.
what we kind of have already. We were built with green infrastructure.
Mhm.
It's turf.
Yeah,
I know
bioswales
what a
can
rain
be,
garden is. I can see the plants and stuff, but I don't know.
yeah. Bioswales are often put next to roadways or parking lots or other pavement, other developed areas to capture. But if they're turf grass, that's one of the least effective things you could possibly plant there. If it's a natural system instead, you can do much better at capture.
So I would
Yes.
get the city to change their rules about requiring the swales to be maintained as turf grass.
Well, that's actually one of the top things you can do in terms of advocating to the city or the village or whichever unit of geography you live in to change those kind of requirements and those kind of landscaping standards. Because requiring mowing, requiring maintenance of different types can actually make it less effective at retaining water, which is one of the goals of it.
Can I ask you to repeat that? What does the city require for swell?
They could have some rules requiring that you keep the swales mowed and.
It has to be lawn.
So we were built with green infrastructure, not because we knew what it was, just because it was cheaper, and we piped an awful lot of it. Just when other people are tearing pipes out and putting swales in, we're doing that.
So a bioswale might be just like what I think of as the ditches in front of houses along Thomas. For instance, and some of them will have, it's the end of the day, cattails sitting in, and I know from my work with volunteering that cattails are not so good because they're invasive. But I also gotten in trouble with my neighbor because I had a naturalized section at my house, and she called it in as weeds greater than 8 inches tall, and it was a big old thing. And the Forest Preserve District luckily came out and certified it as a habitat corridor property, and then that solved that problem. But I've always wondered about those ditches because obviously if they're grassy, you see people, one day they're dangerous because people are slipping around trying to cut the grass on the sides of these ditches. And
Yeah.
it's kind of crazy.
So what I'm showing here, the illustration here, which I like because it shows a cross-section, is actually something a little more advanced you can do, which is plantings. Let's just say these are native plantings. I can't tell the species from here, but it's let's say these are native plantings, but then there's actually infrastructure underneath that as well. So it's not just planted, but it's constructed in such a way that there's also, once the water filters in, there's pipes to remove that and to make that part of the stormwater system. So you can disconnect, or it can be that the underground piece can be part of the storage system. So you can have kind of a both and green infrastructure and conventional infrastructure in a single type of facility.
What hasn't been discussed are French drains. I don't know if anybody's had any experience. Now, this pertains to yard flooding more than river flooding. But has anybody had any experience with that versus natural grass swale, finding the French drain far more effective?
Do you want to define a French drain for the audience?
Well, French drain is actually excavation. I mean, it's a hole, and various contractors do it in different ways, but generally there are at least stones beneath it. There's tubing involved. I never had it done. And then they backfill it, screen it and backfill it.
Yeah, this is not quite, it's similar
It's an
to it.
excavation.
Right, exactly, which is not that unlike what you're seeing happening here.
True, with the dry well, it's certainly an excavation.
Right. Yeah, I mean, again, this is context dependent. I can let people here say what their experience has been, but there may be contexts where that's actually a better solution. I think that, again, this is property by property, but it's a good question. Do others have thoughts on French drains or experience with them?
Well, one of the issues is the clay soil, it doesn't actually drain, it just holds. And they last a couple of years and then clog up.
Even with screening. And it's in the maintenance associated with it as well.
Yeah. So I haven't heard a lot of good success stories with them.
Okay. Other questions? There's almost one? Yes, a question. Yes.
I was a little curious about some other permeable driveway options, because like over in the park in Prospect Heights, they have some kind of, it's kind of like a grid work in grass to
Okay.
drive on.
Yep.
And I thought, well, what's it called?
Like a honeycomb?
Yeah. So I thought, well, that'd be,
Arboretum that in their parking lots.
Yeah.
I thought that would be a great idea, except then how do you deal with snow? So then I was thinking, well, you need to have heat, because heat can melt the snow.
Any form of permeable driveway requires a little more maintenance than a standard just asphalt driveway. So you can plow those types of things, it's just you have to be a little more careful than you otherwise would. But it can be done. One of the reasons you typically see them, or that you don't see them more frequently, is because there is some increased maintenance. Overall, our opinion is in many cases that's worth it. Again, it's site dependent, but a combination of that and kind of bioswales and natural material nearby is a very good solution for preventing runoff there. Okay, yes,
I've
in the back.
heard some say that vegetation in a swale along the way where the water flows can impede water flow. What do you think about that?
I haven't heard that really. I guess that's possible, but I think that we really haven't heard that as a concern. Raising like it creates a blockage which causes flooding upstream. Not really. I mean, if it gets clogged with trash or other forms of debris, that could happen. But if it's
more
well
like you
maintained,
just absorb the water along the way.
yeah, and if it's well maintained, it would have that effect of absorbing water as it goes, and actually reducing flooding upstream because the water is being absorbed there as well. So, yes, sir.
We've actually done that. Who asked that question? Oh, you did. Sorry.
Vegetation is going to slow it down. I mean, there's no, especially if it's heavily vegetated, it will slow the water velocity down. Yes.
It's not going to cause more flooding.
But like you said, it's a trade-off, but if you slow it down, hopefully more of it will get absorbed, and then it would reduce your flooding and the amount of the flashiness further downstream.
I think it all depends on the type of plants that are actually used. But most native plants, while they also have deep root systems, have more biomass below the ground than they do above the ground. So their ability to absorb, filter, to remove toxins is enormous. And so the more that happens, even if it's, you think of this is my little patch, but if your neighbor does a little patch and on down the line, it has a cumulative effect. So.
Yeah. Now, the cumulative impact is huge from doing that kind of work on multiple properties, yes.
We've done that in the ditch that runs in front of our house, between our lawn and the road. Taken out the turf grass, we put in the native plants. And the water that used to pool in that ditch is far less than it used to be. We keep the culvert that goes underneath the driveway clear, so it does travel still through there, but there's no backups and no flooding. In fact, it's by observation only. I mean, there's less water that stands in that ditch. And honestly, it looks better, I think. It certainly attracts more birds and butterflies and things like that, so there's a double benefit.
I think one other real benefit to that, if you look at like St. Al's, that used to be just standing water, which of course means mosquitoes. If that water is not standing there, the mosquitoes are not there. So there's that other benefit that's really tangible.
Yeah, right. Are there any other examples of positive improvements like that people have seen that you think are worth replicating? Maybe, do you have a question first?
I have a question first.
Response? Yeah.
Could you go back to the picture of St. Alphonsus?
Yes, that's this one.
Okay, so that's a retention area and it has a capacity. So when you plant the grasses in there, does that impact how does that impact the capacity of what that area can hold?
Our experience is it increases it because the plants themselves are able to soak in some of the water. So it's better, I mean, you could make that just a concrete bowl and that would have some capacity.
But it has an outflow on it. So when it reaches a certain level, the water then starts leaving that area and then traveling downstream. So does having, though it's beautiful,
Yeah.
and it serves other purposes, does it impact the overall capacity that was designed for?
Well, because the roots of the plants are able to soak in more water than it otherwise would have, it actually increases its capacity to retain and detain water. So compared to something that does not have that absorptive capacity. So I think you're asking because there's plant material in there that's obviously taking up space. And volume.
Right, that's my question.
So, right. The trade-off you're getting there is while it does take up volume, obviously, the ability of it to soak up water through the roots exceeds that and makes it a better system than something that would not have that. So this is, yeah.
You know,
go ahead.
occasionally I actually give lectures to groups like this, and there's this one great slide I wish I had that shows a picture of pavement and turf grass and tree area and then native plant area. It says percent of water absorbed in each one. And the percent of water absorbed is dramatically different. Like in pavement, there's almost zero absorption.
Right.
And then you get to turf grass, which is very little absorption. And then you get to trees and stuff and minimum absorption. And then you get to plants like this and there's tremendous absorption. So although it takes up space, it's absorbing so much more water. So
If you want a real good example, next time we get a really heavy rain, just go there and see what happens.
I live just south of there.
Oh, okay.
So I'm very familiar with this whole ecosystem that we have.
Yeah, you go out there, it's dry after a major rain event. Yes, and it wasn't like that before.
I've lived there for 20 years, so I could, yeah, it retains water. I mean, and when it was, before all the grass was in there, yeah, it would just be a pondy.
Right.
Yeah, and so I was just wondering, as far as how that impacted capacity, so I'm very encouraged to hear that it will absorb, but these 100-year events are coming more often.
Well, yeah, they're once a year, so. Yeah, and that was a great answer. You said that more coherently than I was saying it, so thank you for the ad there. Yeah, go ahead.
Where is this located? I'm not familiar.
It's on Wheeling Road, just south of California.
Oh,
Right where Willow Road tees into Wheeling,
okay.
right there.
Oh, okay.
This is looking east at the site. I think it's on the east side of the street. Other questions? Yes, in the back. Yeah.
So getting back to wherever this woman here lives, where it requires the turf and the swale. So if we're in Prospect Heights, can we put a rain garden like what they have at St. Al's in our swales?
I don't know the regulations in Prospect Heights. It sounds like you were able to do that.
That's
Yeah.
not really our property, that is.
Right.
Maybe Mark can speak to that.
Yes. As long as you maintain your property, there's no requirement that you have turf grass there. Many residents have done all types of different things, from turf grass to gravel to gutter systems. If you drive around town, you see all types of creative ways to handle the water. Native plantings is a great idea. It doesn't fit for everyone's home and their lifestyle. That's the only trade-off that you run into. So there's nothing that says you can't do some nice plantings at the front yard, as long as you're maintaining your property. I mean, that's really the big picture of being a resident.
Would we be allowed to put a simple black rubber drain tile on our property to route water as long as it stayed on our property?
As long as you talk to our building guys and make sure you're not draining your water like to your neighbor's
Yeah, I'm
low
saying,
spot.
if you caught water on your property and you routed it to the street on your property
Yeah.
and you never left, that would be an okay thing.
You should get your idea, your plan approved by the building and zoning guys though, just to make sure what you're doing fits. But yeah, that's very common around town because the backyards fill up with water, the front yards are usually where there's swales or culverts. So all the stormwater that's not sucked into the earth on your own property makes its way to the front typically and then goes down the street. Every neighborhood's different, but we all have similar things where we're pretty darn flat and there's not a lot of pitch. So we're all here for the same reason because we all have had water issues. We've seen neighbors with water issues. But being a community like we are, a rural community, our infrastructure isn't what you'd find with the big deep tunnel. Our goal is everything gravitates towards the creek and then makes its way through out to the river. So We're all in a, basically, we don't have a deep tunnel. It'd be nice if we did at times, but McDonald Creek is our exit.
If I heard him correctly, he was talking about it draining into the street.
Into the culvert,
Oh,
because the streets are designed to shed into the front yards,
right.
the crown and the culverts and the ditches. So if you have your gutters up by the house, the ideal way would be to some type of way to get them to dissipate through the grass to the street, because you want as much absorption as possible. But some people have issues where there's just, the house is lower, the way it was built, the design, the terrain, so there's different, as he had mentioned, every property is unique, but we all have this similar type of issues where water. I've been in town my whole life, and I'm right there with you, so.
You get water?
Yeah. So I appreciate your presentation.
This is a great point. And I think your point about native plants not working for everyone is correct, but I also think that many people just, turf grass is the easier thing or the more common thing to do, so it takes an extra level of effort, I think, to figure out how to do native plantings. And so we would encourage people to think about that as an option, because it is far more effective than turf grass. It's not a requirement, of course, but it is very effective at dealing with the flooding problems, particularly if multiple neighbors in a row or in an area can do that, where really you get the combined benefits will help the entire neighborhood. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I just want to make a comment that if you have a lot of water on your property, in a sense, there's two solutions. One is to get it off your property, funnel it out off your property, and in Prospect Heights, funnel it down through the culvert system and funnel it into the creek and away. Or another possibility is to have it absorbed on your own yard where it fell. From an environmental perspective, you want the second, not the first. Because from an environmental perspective, when you have it all carried out, historically, we're carrying out so much more water from our property than was than the natural system. The natural system isn't supposed to carry away so much water. And the other thing that we've done is we put chemicals in our yard, and we also have oil on our streets and things like that. So the more water we carry away from our properties, the more chemicals we're carrying away from our properties, the more we're flooding it down to the creek, and we might figure out of sight, out of mind. But once it's down the creek, it goes to the river, once it goes to the river, it goes so on and so forth. And for example, we are part of why there are dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico, because all our chemicals and all our oil is just going down to the creek, which is going down to the river, which is going down to Mississippi, which is going to the Gulf of Mexico. So optimally, you prefer to have that water that falls on your property stay on your property. Now, I know you don't want it to flood your basement, but if there's ways you can get it to stay on your property by being absorbed by plants, that's what would be happening.
Realistically, though, Prospect Heights is flat, but it's not that flat. Properties drain onto other properties. So 3 years ago, when we had that 4 inches of rain in 1 hour or whatever it was, if you have 3 properties draining onto yours, that's a foot of water. And at 8 gallons per cubic foot, and you've got maybe a 3/4 acre lot of cubic feet to calculate, you've got 500,000 gallons of water draining onto your property, and no plants are going to absorb that. It's got to go somewhere.
Why do the neighbors' yards drain onto yours?
Because that's the slope of the ground.
Just the slope. Yeah,
It's not, you might have a 1 foot pitch over 400 feet, but that's all it is.
Yeah, if you're at the bottom of that solution, then, yeah, I agree with you, it's probably gonna be difficult for those plants to absorb most of that. Although, like Gerald Wilhelm has said frequently, that a mature prairie will absorb everything that a 100-year flood can deliver to it.
Right, but there's a time factor.
But if the 2 properties above you who were draining into your yard did the same thing, then that effect is totally reduced as it comes down to you. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's honestly, even gray infrastructure pipes also would have trouble handling that kind of rainfall. So when you get these really historically significant events like you just described, there's going to be flooding after those events. What we try to do is find ways to minimize those, to have them happen as infrequently as possible, and when they do, to mitigate. So the point about if all your upstream neighbors had green infrastructure and native plantings that soaked up water, it would reduce the amount that gets to your property. Now, in that kind of huge event, you would still get some, but it would be less. And so there really is no 100% solution to the climate changes that we're seeing, but we want to try to look for solutions that help you most of the time, and then mitigate at least when you have these really extreme events. Yes, ma'am?
Does keeping rainfall where it lands aid your wells at all? Versus
Yes.
sending it down to the creek?
Absolutely, yes. Depending on if it's in the right places, you can recharge groundwater. It depends again on the detail and where that water is going to flow once it gets into the ground, but sometimes it can recharge underground aquifers if it falls in the right place. I don't know the specifics here about whether that would happen or not. Perhaps the hydrologist knows, but I don't.
It's going into the ground, but I assume your well is deeper than that. You might be in a totally different aquifer, but
Right.
yes, it's going into the ground. Yes, which is good.
Your average 100
Right.
feet.
And I just want to think that was good that he put in a duration on his rainfall event. That's been lacking in all of these discussions,
This
the
is true. I'm guilty
duration
of that
of the
too.
rainfall event.
Mhm.
The FEMA maps are for a 24-hour, 100-year rainfall.
Mhm.
So you can have a 100-year rainfall in an hour,
Right.
and then you really have big problems.
And one of the impacts of climate, which has been seen, is an increase in the frequency of more severe storms. And so the amount of rainfall is going up some, but you see even more heavily going up is just a lot of water being dumped at once.
The
And so-
intensity is
right.
increasing dramatically.
Yep.
Bob, I think
Yes,
probably
sir.
maybe the last question, because we're running out of time, but if anyone in Prospect Heights, or, from the city, or us, the commissions, or any of the other any municipalities that might be here, want to work with CNT, what do they do?
Well, the first thing, I have a ton of business cards, so people can email me if you just want resources. I'm happy to provide them a link to the presentation, a link to some of the online tools I showed. All of those things are easy. If it's a more complicated thing, like help my community solve a problem, I'm still the right person to talk to, and I can talk to our staff and maybe other community organizations where you are to see if there's something that we could do. We are a nonprofit. We're generally supported with philanthropic grants and some with fee-for-service contracts, and so we can work in different places, but somebody has to pay us for that to work. That's usually not residents directly. It's usually either a local government or a foundation or somebody like that who sees the value of the work and is able to support it. But the first thing for us is knowing where there's interest in having some kind of collective solution to a flooding problem, and then from there we try to figure out how we can help. So I've got a whole stack of cards that I'm happy to hand out to people who have further questions. But, okay, thank you all very much. It was great.